Hello and welcome to the Deindustrialization and Politics of Our Time podcast. My name is Gabriel and I'm pursuing a master's in history at Concordia University. I'm joining you from Montreal, Quebec, also known as Shukshogé, on the unceded and occupied territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Sinead, who is also here, can you introduce yourself and tell us where you're coming from?
Hi, yes. So my name is Sinead and I am a PhD student at Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland. I'm doing a PhD at the minute in history, and I am currently looking at photography as a historical source.
Can you tell us a little bit more, sort of outline a little bit of your research?
Yeah. So basically my research is focusing on photographic representations of childhood. In particular, I'm focusing on the sort of time frame between the late 60s and the late 90s. And I'm focusing on how childhood was represented in different forms and genres of photography. So it's quite a mix.
And where does sort of deindustrialization fit into your work?
So I think through the analysis of a lot of the photographs, obviously my time period coincides with the conflict in Northern Ireland, so that was a big aspect of it. But interestingly, what I found through my research was that deindustrialization actually was impacting massively at the time as well. So it was interesting actually to look at these photographs through sort of twin lenses. So looking at conflict and also the role that deindustrialization played.
Wow, that's super interesting. So it's sort of you're looking at the sort of like the perspective, like childhood perspectives almost on deindustrialization.
Yes and no. Probably the impact on childhood, firstly, but I sort of have found that the childhood perspective comes into it a little bit, particularly because I'm sort of using oral history methods as well. So I think I will end up, by the end of my research, I think I'll have a lot more perspectives from people that are older now, but from what they felt when they were younger. So yeah, I think that'll be an unexpected finding.
Nice. Cool. So given that today we are talking about photographs, in a previous conversation, you sort of talked a little bit about how you came to sort of be interested in photographs, and I was wondering if you could tell us about that.
Yeah. So I first found sort of photographs within the study of history in my second year of my undergrad. I actually did a module on Chinese history, but they were primarily using photographs as their main source base. So it was through that module that I started to get to grips with how to use photographs critically. But kind of outside of academia, I've always been interested in photography. It's always been something that us as a family, we've always kind of done as a hobby. We've always had a lot of pictures in the house. So it's something that I felt really comfortable with. And I think within an academic kind of context, I was surprised that I hadn't used them before. So when the module in Chinese history came up, I was so excited to get to grips with them within an academic context. And it just kind of spiraled from there.
Yeah. And what was it sort of, what do you think it was about the photographs, or about photographs in particular, that drew you in, especially in the context of history?
I think there's just so much potential to photographs. Historians don't often use them that much, which I feel has kind of negated that potential a little bit. There's so much that you can do with them. And I think photographs have such a rich history. Each and every image has such a rich history that it's this untapped potential that we've not got to grips with yet. Um, but at the same time, in the same vein, because we haven't got to grips with it, I don't necessarily think that they're used critically enough. Very often historians and academics will use photographs as an illustration, but they maybe won't necessarily critique them as much as they would with a textual source. So it's always kind of excited me in two fronts. Like, yes, there's so much that we can do with them and they can tell us so much. There's so much potential. But at the same time, we're not looking at them hard enough. So when we do look at them, we need to make sure that we're looking at them with a critical lens and we're interrogating them as much as we should be.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about the connection that you made just now between, photographs in your, I guess, your personal life, or photographs at home, and coming across them in the context of university. And the sort of familiarity there that, at least my experience with academia thus far, has been it's sort of like encountering a lot of unfamiliar things. And being exposed to a lot of ideas and perhaps a lot of history and frameworks and things that I've really had to grapple with, and it's just interesting to think about photographs in that context being these familiar things in an unfamiliar landscape.
Yeah, for sure. That's sort of exactly what I felt like whenever I first started looking at them. Because I remember thinking, God, I look at photos all the time. Like, surely this should be, whenever I was reading photos, I go, oh, there's this and that and this and that in them. And I used to always think, surely this should be harder. Because I'm so used to looking at photographs. You're like, oh yes, I remember this. I've looked at it in this way before. So yeah, there was a real familiarity, I think. And that is a really nice feeling, actually. Especially in a world of unfamiliar things where, in academia you're constantly grappling with something new, something difficult. That it's actually really nice to look at something familiar and feel quite comfortable with it. So yeah, that's a really important point. I don't think I'd ever really explored myself before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's sort of coming back to also something that you said about, and that we're going to talk about a lot more in terms of thinking through photographs critically and thinking about ways to read them. That the sort of, it's not that it's a double-edged sword, so much as, encountering these familiar things in a different framework, presents the opportunity to, read them in the context of that framework. It just, it speaks to what we're going to talk a lot about in terms of photographs being these sort of strange objects that appear in lots of different places, and that, are complicated and difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They're familiar objects in unfamiliar spaces.
Yeah.
I think that's when the real sort of juiciness comes out. That's when you start to get, that's when the potential really reveals itself, I think.
Okay, so before we talk more about the methodology that you're using, and maybe more how we can think about photographs in the context of historical research, I thought I'm going to read a little, an excerpt from an essay by John Berger. The essay is called Uses of Photography, and it was written sort of in response to Susan Sontag's On Photography. And I thought I'll just read this little excerpt. It'll take about 2.5 minutes, and then we can reflect on it. So here we go. Human visual perception is a far more complex and selective process than that by which a film records. I should say, when John Berger uses the word film, he means the medium that preceded digital, not cinema. So I digress. So Human visual perception is a far more complex and selective process than that by which a film records. Nevertheless, the camera lens and the eye both register images because of their sensitivity to light, at great speed and in the face of an immediate event. What the camera does, however, and what the eye in itself can never do, is to fix the appearance of that event. It removes its appearance from the flow of appearances, and it preserves it, not perhaps forever, but for as long as the film exists. The essential character of this preservation is not dependent upon the image being static. Unedited film rushes to preserve in essentially the same way the camera saves a set of appearances from the otherwise inevitable supersession of further appearances. It holds them unchanging, and before the invention of the camera, nothing could do this except, in the mind's eye, the faculty of memory. I am not saying that memory is a kind of film. That is a banal simile. From the comparison film-memory, we learn nothing about the latter. What we learn is how strange and unprecedented was the procedure of photography. Yet, unlike memory, photographs do not in themselves preserve meaning. They offer appearances, with all the credibility and gravity we normally lend to appearances, prized away from their meaning. Meaning is the result of understanding functions, and functioning takes place in time and must be explained in time. Only that which narrates can make us understand. Photographs in themselves do not narrate. Photographs preserve instant appearances. Habit now protects us against the shock involved in such preservation. Compare the exposure time for a film with the life of the print made, and let us assume that the print only lasts 10 years. The ratio for an average modern photograph would be approximately 20 billion to 1. Perhaps that can serve as a reminder of the violence of the fission whereby appearances are separated by the camera from their function. I'd just like to invite you to reflect on that if there's anything that sort of stood out to you.
Yeah, I think I've always loved John Berger, and his work has been really influential in terms of the development of my theoretical framework and my methodology and things. And definitely in that passage, what really strikes me is his awareness that when a photograph's taken, that image essentially becomes removed. It's a fixed image that becomes completely removed from sort of time and space. And what can often happen whenever an image is taken, you can read it as something that is completely removed from where it came from, or you can try and look at it within a much larger ecology. And Berger's really good because he does kind of speak about photography in a very physiological sense, which I think is really useful because it is this kind of real embodied action and activity. Very rarely are we able to replicate an actual function of our body, but photography, it does that. But I think what he asks us to do is really to remind ourselves that a photograph is deeply connected to many different systems, much in the way that your body is made up of so many different systems, of which your eyes are a small part. So that's something that's really underpinned a lot of my methods and my sort of theoretical frameworks, is really bearing in mind that an image is connected to so many different things. Pardon me. And it's not just this kind of dead object that miraculously appears. It's connected to the photographer that took the picture. It's connected to social contexts, cultural, material, political. And I think our job as historians and as academics is to learn to appreciate that connectivity and to really look at the bigger picture, rather than just treating these objects, these photographs that are objects removed from a context, through the process of through the camera, I should say, and instead actually look at a kind of more organic picture of what it is that they're connected to, and treat them more like living objects rather than dead objects, I would say.
Yeah. Wow, that's really, really beautifully said. And the, I mean, this is kind of what we're going to get to next, but the sort of question of how you do that is the question. Because what, this sort of web of relations that photographs are sort of always in, and that we maybe need to learn to see them as always being in this web of relations, this constellation of relations, this sort of, I mean, I love the image of the body and how the body is all, we have all these different parts, but they're actually all connected, and that it's difficult to see that in photographs because of what Berger calls the sort of like the violence of the fission of their removal from this one instant in time, and that they seem sort of to stand alone in this self-evident way, that is, it's sort of hard to see through that, or it's hard to see into that sometimes, maybe especially because of the way that we consume them in our sort of, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
So maybe we could move on to or move into then talking about what I just said in terms of sort of bringing the uncovering of these kinds of connections that are possible through photographs into a more sort of concrete approach. So do you want to maybe talk about the methodology that you're using?
Yeah, sure. So I think just before I kind of move into the proper methodology, I do think it's important to note that one of the reasons why I think academics don't really use photographs that much is precisely because they don't know how to. And as a result of that, there's never really been a concrete methodology that has been consistently replicated. So I think what you find often with historians, especially that use photographs, is that they kind of use them in their own unique way. Some historians will choose to focus much more on the social relations surrounding a photographer, the immediate cultural sort of context that they emerged from. Whereas sort of what I have focused on much more is a kind of a 3-step process that takes those cultural connections and different contexts into account, but which also perhaps leans a little bit more towards sort of art history and the visual analysis of photographs. But I'll take you kind of step by step, but just a disclaimer that this is an entirely kind of self-designed methodology rather than, sort of well-known replicated method.
Wonderful.
But it's very simple sort of method, to be honest. The first step usually would involve kind of the itemization of what's in a photograph. So essentially I'll look at a photograph and I'll just list everything that's in that image. So you could have a list of 5 things or a list of 50 things, depending on what the photograph is. The second stage of my method is then to look at doing a sort of compositional analysis. So this is where it kind of feels quite art history like, because I'll look at how the photographer has actually composed the image. I'll look for things like the use of light, leading lines, if the photographers use the rule of thirds. These little tools that kind of open up the image a little bit more and tell us a little bit more about what it was that the photographer was trying to kind of get across. And then the last stage will be to construct a context around that. So essentially, I'll look at the social, economic, political, cultural, material context from which that photograph emerged from. So essentially, what you're doing is you're moving from just telling somebody what's in a photograph to actually analysing how those images or those objects or things in that photograph, how they were placed together and what effect that had and what effect that has, I should say, on the viewer, and then connecting that to the wider context. So going back to the kind of body analogy, you're sort of moving away from the eyes and into the rest of the body. You know, you're seeing what's there, you're seeing how it makes you feel, but then you're moving to different places. And I think that's really what kind of underpins my method, is just trying to connect those images to other images, people, places, things, and to try and sort of reawaken it a little bit, you know, rather than seeing an image as completely self-evident and completely on its own by itself. I'll try and reconnect it to different contexts to really sort of build up the history of that image and tell that image, the story of that image. But I would say that the method is very much influenced by deep viewing, which was a method put forward by Anne Watts Paley-Tet, and she was an educationalist, but she kind of followed that same sort of 3-step process as a way of looking further into images and just seeing that little bit more, rather than taking an image at face value. It's just excavating that little bit deeper. So that's kind of what I use in general, and it's been a product of kind of writing for my undergrad, writing for my master's, and now writing for my PhD. It's something that's kind of always evolving, but I think this is the one that is the most fruitful. I think this is what I found has enabled me to kind of reconnect images to different contexts. And I think that's what's really important, you know, to the use of, you know, to anybody using photographs as a historical source, or indeed in any form of academia, really. You know, it can be used in different ways.
Mm. And so, if you wouldn't mind, I don't want to preempt the press or the publishing of your work, but yeah, I guess I would love to hear about some of the sort of the collections of photographs, or the sort of photographs that you are working with, if you wouldn't mind talking about that.
Yeah, sure. So the way that I've kind of structured my PhD thesis is to look at different genres of photography. So you have things like press photography, documentary photography, community photography, and amateur photography. So one of the collections I'm working on at the minute is a collection by a photographer who's based in Belfast, and he's worked with he used to work with a community photography organisation called Belfast Exposed. And what they did was they essentially taught people how to use cameras, and they would go out into their local communities and they would take pictures. And this guy, his collection is incredible. I'm going to say anybody's photograph collection is incredible, especially if I'm using them. But it's incredible in the sense that he has archived it so well and so clearly that it's a researcher's dream. But one of the things that I really liked about his work, and one of the reasons why I decided to focus on one of his collections, was just how he was able to capture an essence of childhood, which I haven't really come across to such an extent outside of my own personal photograph albums. So it was quite an unexpected sort of feeling. But what I sort of came to realize whenever I was looking at it was that it was the familiarity of the images that struck me so deeply. And I think that's something that, depending on the photograph collection that you're working with, you won't always get. And generally what I would do whenever I've kind of encountered a collection that I'm really interested in and I want to write about, I tend to kind of have a look through everything, and see what visual themes emerge, or see if there's a lot of visual tropes that are replicated, and really try and see patterns in it. And what I found with his was that these patterns that maybe would have taken me a while to kind of sift through and identify were really obvious. And they were obvious because they were the same sort of visual tropes that we're all so familiar with, because they're the same tropes that we have in our family photograph albums. And it's things like that really. It makes kind of what I do in terms of working with photographs, it makes it really special, because it's not often that we do get those links between familiarity and rigorous academic scholarship. So it's quite a rare thing to find. And yeah, it's probably been one of the nicest unexpected moments, I would say, in my sort of research journey. But yeah, it's interesting, because I think, every collection is unique and every collection is different, and they're interesting in many different ways. But for me, it was that familiarity that really hooked me, I would say.
Wow, cool. And this is this is quite a large collection,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah. I think there's about 7,000 images in it, but I've seen a much smaller number of them, but there is a lot in the back room waiting.
Yeah.
So we'll see if I can get through that. But
Cool.
I don't think it will.
And so you're employing the methodology, the sort of the steps that you laid out just now. You're employing that methodology to, I don't know if reconstruct is the right word, but certainly to think about childhood experience in the context of deindustrialization and conflict.
Yeah, I think so. The sort of 3-step process is, I would usually go into that in much more detail once I've identified certain visual tropes that emerge. I'm lucky with the PhD because I'm focusing on childhood. So every image that I look at tends to have something very clearly related to childhood in it. So either a child or something related to a concept of childhood. So that enables me almost automatically to sift through images and start with the foundation. And then what I'll do is start to list what's in the images. And that's when you start to see these visual tropes emerging, these patterns that emerge. You can see whether or not there's a particular object is very common, or a place, a person. You start to build up a picture of the whole, as opposed to each image as a separate part. And then following that stage, that's when you start to kind of look at the compositional analysis. Sometimes you do see a lot of sort of replication in terms of composition. Some photographers really like using certain methods. They'll either focus a lot on the use of light, or they'll focus a lot on leading lines, implied motion and movement. So that's actually really interesting, because you can start to see a pattern emerging in how a photographer actually approaches photographing different things. And then from that stage, you start to build up much more of a context around it in terms of um, sort of social, political, cultural, economic, that sort of thing. Build up the systems afterwards. So you gradually build up more and more of a picture and can really start to kind of put the story back together again a little bit.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow, super interesting. When we spoke about this conversation, um, you talked a little bit about how thinking about the intent of the photographer has been something that has been important to you, and it's maybe part of that third step of thinking through the context. Can you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, for sure. I think I've always felt it important to include the voice of the photographer in any research that I do, partly because I don't want, I don't feel comfortable not having the voice of the maker, I suppose, um, because then sometimes maybe feel that I am repurposing an image to suit my academic agenda. And that's something that I've always tried to challenge and really pull myself up on, because at the end of the day, we look at images and the images tell us the story. We don't imprint our academic agenda on the photographs. It's the most heavenly feeling in the world when those two things align, but we need to be really rigorous in preventing kind of us from forcing the images to conform to our argument. I think it's really important for the intent of a photographer to be considered, because it's important to get photographers involved on the historical record, I suppose. I want their voices to be included, and I don't want to construct something that's wholly different from the intention behind the photographer themselves. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind within academia, within academic circles, is that we can't allow the sources to we can't imprint our arguments onto the sources all the time. We need to let the sources speak. So the best way to do that, often when using visual sources, if possible, is to include the perspective of the photographer.
Hmm. Hmm. Again, it's really interesting. And yeah, as a photographer, this is something that I have thought about and tried to grapple with quite a bit, because that is this is what we're talking about right now, is one of the things that makes photographs kind of so intriguing and mysterious, is that as the photographer, you have this important role in the process of photography, where you are the one operating the camera, and your presence in a given situation is not accidental. And you are, in many cases, or all the time, you're choosing to be somewhere. You're choosing to use a certain kind of equipment. You have your sort of your motivation of whether it's storytelling or what you have, your motivations, and yet there is also only so much you can do, because the act of photography is that removal of a visual instant, of something in the world that already exists. In that sense, and what I'm trying to say is, it's not like painting. It's not like other forms of representation where you are it's not the same act of interpretation as those kinds of acts of representation, where as the photographer, you go out into the world and you take photographs, but the photographs are of things that you didn't make.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it is interesting to think about intent, because I think there are many potential readings of any one photograph, and the reading that I give to my own photographs is very, very different than the reading that the people photographed would give to those same photographs. And I do think that intent, of the photographer is something that's important to grapple with. And I also think that maybe outside, and maybe this is the case outside of academia mostly, that there is sometimes too much intent,
Mhm.
too much paying attention to the intent
Mhm.
of the photographer that is assigned, as if they are invested with sort of like all the power
Yeah,
and all of the discursive power of deciding, quote unquote, what these photographs are about.
I think it speaks a lot to the constructed nature of photography, and I guess probably with um, in terms of the importance to me of including the intent of the photographer and to try and get their voices inserted into the historical narrative. I think part of that is just also being aware of the constructed nature of photography. It is made in, in up to a certain extent, but I think it's just being aware that a photographer has a level of control um, in terms of composition and things that we need to be aware of, and it does open up those questions that you were touching upon there. Um, and yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing to ponder.
Yeah. And and I mean, here we are, sort of two photography nerds saying that everybody should pay attention to photography. But I mean, I think everybody should. But I do think that this point of of just how many conversations become possible when you start thinking about photographs and when you start trying to figure out what is going on, because they, like we've already said, they are often presented as sort of self-evident, and they occupy this. We are surrounded by
Mhm.
images, in so many different ways, and they occupy this sort of specific role that often isn't interrogated. And then once you start asking questions, they become much more interesting, and they can be used for all different kinds of things, whether it's
For sure.
it's it's research or in personal life, or yeah.
Yeah.
I digress. Okay, so let's see here. Um, okay, so as we bring this conversation more to a close, I thought we could bring the conversation about photographs and photography back into a conversation about deindustrialization. And in the field of deindustrialization, there is an ongoing conversation, debate about the sort of relationship between aesthetics and the sort of visual nature of deindustrialization, or the visuality of deindustrialization, and a certain kind of, ruin porn is something that's talked about a lot. Maybe I just ask you to reflect on sort of like what people can take away from this conversation, as it pertains to the use of photographs with respect to deindustrialization.
Yeah. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when you say that deindustrialization has a visuality. It has such a defined visuality that it's really embedded in the popular consciousness now. I think when people think about deindustrialization, they think about ruined buildings, they think about former industrial sites that are covered in moss, they think about sort of decimated communities, and it's an instantaneous reaction. And I think, in terms of the debate around the aestheticization of it, I think that comes from just looking at photographs of these buildings, these places on one level. So essentially, you're stopping at the level of sort of content analysis. You're looking at these things. You're saying, yes, okay, that's a ruined building. That's you know, a partially demolished shipyard. That's all it is. Whereas I think what a lot of scholars now are asking us to do is to move past that and to really see the larger picture. Yes, those representations are one form of, you know, representations of deindustrialization. It's one way of looking at it, whereas what I'm trying to do and what others have advocated for is to reinsert those images into the larger context, to look at not only how these images were constructed compositionally from the perspective of the photographer, but also to consider how they were connected to other aspects of deindustrialization. And I think that's one of the things that I'm focusing on in the thesis, is really looking at how an area that became deindustrialized, how that changed, and then how that was photographed. To give you a bit of an example and to kind of shine a little bit more light on it, my research looks at an area in Belfast called Lower Falls in the west of the city. And this area used to be the centre of sort of textile production. First of all, it was cotton, and then it was linen. And throughout the mid sort of 20th century, as deindustrialization progressed, that area started to lose a lot of mills, to lose a lot of employment. And what was interesting about this area was that it was women that occupied these roles in the factories. And when the factory shut, there was very little alternative full-time employment that these women could engage in. So a lot of them ended up sort of moving into the public sector, part-time roles. But what was interesting also is that this area was undergoing a huge amount of deindustrialization, but at the same time, it was also undergoing a lot of slum clearance, a lot of redevelopment. So the physical face of the area was changing so much. And it was that drew photographers in. They wanted to see how Belfast had started to change so much from this grand Victorian city into this kind of wasteland. And what my research looks at really is the impact of processes of deindustrialization on communities at a very basic level. So how things like housing changed, how employment impacted families, how employment impacted unemployment, impacted gender dynamics. So essentially what I try and do is look at these photographs at the kind of first stage. Some people might argue that you could say it's the aestheticization, just about got on it, of kind of former industrial areas. But then I'll look past that and try and say, right, okay, well, how were these images constructed? What is it that gives us the reaction that we take when we look at these photographs? And then how was an area like this? Tell me more about the history of this area. Tell me about the social history, the cultural history, political history. Try and connect it to these different contexts. And then eventually you start to build up much more picture, it's the wrong word, much more of a history around these photographs. And I think that's when you start to move past that kind of ruin porn argument. It's when you actually say, well, hold on, there's so much more to these images than just the aestheticization of decline.
Yeah. Yeah, I think perhaps to be fair, in a book like Stephen Hayes' Corporate Wasteland, like the argument about what is done with photographs of, sort of like ruin porn, or the, in this case, he was writing about the sort of like urban explorer class of people who do the exact opposite of what you just said, in terms of like zero historical context, zero, anything to sort of contextualize what it is that had happened in these places, and that that there is this sort of cotton industry of of that kind of visual
Mhm.
sort of representation, or of these kinds of yeah. Um, but maybe what I hear you saying is that also that it's possible to maybe take a different reading of those photographs.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, everybody can apply a different reading of any photograph, but I think essentially what I'm trying to do is to read it in a slightly different way, and then to construct more around it. You know, I don't necessarily look at an image and just take it at face value. I'll try and interrogate it a little bit more. I'll try and look to the wider context to see what, if anything, influenced it, the creation of it. But importantly as well, I try and use textual sources alongside the images, to do that, to try and build up a bigger history of the image, or um, to tell the image's story. And I think that's necessary, and perhaps that's maybe been lacking in traditional kind of studies of visualities of deindustrialization, is that there's maybe an awareness to kind of dive in with both feet into the visual without necessarily consulting the textual in order to build that context. And yeah, I think there's probably a lot that can be written still about many images that have been deemed sort of ruin porn. But I think to start with, you do need to consider beyond the image itself. You need to look further.
Hmm. Hmm. Great. Okay, so winding down here, would you care to leave us with any sort of final thoughts about using photographs in historical research and as sources?
What I will say is that we can use photographs even though they're difficult. I think it's interesting because photographs are seen as problematic and, potentially difficult. Whereas in reality, I think all sort of historical sources can be problematic and difficult. So I do feel that photography's had a bit of a bad rap, but I think there's so much that can be done, and there's so much potential there. So I would encourage people to not be afraid and to engage with it as much or as little as you like. But yeah, don't be afraid of it.
I think that's a great way to end. Um, so I will link all of the work, or the authors that we mentioned. I'll make sure to link all of those in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much, Sinead,
No worries.
for this wonderful conversation. This was
Thank
really
you so
lovely.
much. It was so good. It's just so nice talking um talking about it. So thank you so much.